must speak the truth about terrorism. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice. What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
Delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the Antedote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gugel.
And Jeremy, we're doing something a little different tonight. You wanna describe what we're doing here real quick?
We are doing a live recording on Clubhouse in a room that we created. It's a public room titled Limbaugh Fox, Tools of Malaise or War, Antedote recording. And we're going to be recording this here, and if people want to join us, they can. But we're going to break down this topic tonight, and we are same time slot here on Clubhouse as Bill Gates.
Yeah, Bill Gates is. I think we've had a little bit of trouble with our connection because Bill Gates has, I believe, 8,000 people in a room with him and Aaron Ross Sorkin of the New York Times. I believe you said that's a record for Clubhouse. So,
yeah, I think they expanded the rooms just for Bill Gates to come on, and they're gobbling up all of the server bandwidth. It seems like.
Well, if I was loyal to humanity, I guess I would be in the room shouting at Bill Gates about adrenochrome, but I'm here instead. So take that for what it's worth.
What are you going to do? Be talking about facts and stuff, Greg? About the intergenerational destruction of the American conservative mind?
Yeah. So, as I'm sure pretty much anybody who's going to tune into this, at least in the U.S., and probably a lot of people in our non-American audience are well aware of the talk show, the top American talk radio host, Rush Limbaugh, died a week ago Wednesday after a battle with cancer. And the reason we wanted to do this room is because to me and you, Rush Limbaugh is symbolic of what we've been covering over the last several years in terms of, he epitomized what we've been covering over the last several years with the combination of like the propaganda warfare that we've really covered took place with the rise of Cambridge Analytica, and the online operations took place through social media, primarily, but this has been an operation at the same time also that is nothing new. Short-term and a long-term aspects of this, I would say this propaganda warfare primarily aimed at the conservative American base. And Rush Limbaugh, to me, was the person who epitomized this more than anybody. Is I think without Rush Limbaugh, who, without a doubt, for better or for worse, is an iconic figure in modern American history, one of the most influential figures in the modern history of the United States. And I would say his influence is probably the worst. I mean, I think you and I can both agree on that, and we'll elaborate on that as we talk. But the events, the rise of Trump and everything that's taken place since would not have been possible without the crucial role Rush Limbaugh played in getting this, what we're going to talk about, what we see as a particularly toxic reactionary narrative out to millions of regular everyday Americans on his radio platform for 3 hours every day, going back to the late 1980s up until the time of his death.
Yeah, in many ways, Limbaugh is not only a symbol of a lot of the things that we've been dissecting and digesting on the Antedote, mainly over the 4 years of Trump and now into the Biden years. But he was instrumental. He was maybe the instrumental public tool of the salting of the fields of the middle American mind. And that's where you really see it, is in the middle of the country, really. And, we've tuned into, being that we both live, we got our own little intellectual border war thing going on here. Greg, you over there in bushwhacker country, Missouri, and me over here in abolitionist Lawrence, Kansas. But meanwhile, we're both very tuned in to some of it's interesting. It's on Twitter where we actually begin to understand the dissection of the negative influence over the decades in terms of the actual political impact on the ground, in terms of like the nature of the Republican Party, but also just in terms of the evisceration of the quality and the base ethics of the political conversation in the United States of America. And I think, there's a triumvirate in certain ways. And so we brought in Fox into this because that's the key platform. Limbaugh might be the key figure. Fox, Murdoch is the key platform. And those two are sort of like the twin pillars, I would say, of the destruction of the middle American mind that laid the groundwork, as you said, for what, became the 11/9 operation in terms of the Trump installation and the wake of that we're still dealing with, which includes the reactionary blowback and the conditions under which you then have, some of these characters who come back into position, people who supported the Iraq War, for example, and someone like Anthony Blinken rising back to ascendancy, people like Merrick Garland, instrumental in the wake of the domestic black op Oklahoma City incident, which we've talked a lot on the Antedote about how this time reminds us of those 90s. And that's what's so interesting about this is that's when Limbaugh really came into hardcore effect, and then also paving the way for, the Alex Jones intensification of the rhetoric. And we, early on in the Antedote, we actually discussed the deeper background of some of this intellectual milieu, which we trace back to, the John Birch Society as the intellectual godfather of all of this. But the intensification really takes place where it goes full fly operational. And we pointed this out before, but it looks like Murdoch's Fox is the first foreign owned big media corporation in the United States in our history. And so that's not something to be lightly dismissed. And it's not just some kind of, jingoism or sort of ultra nationalism of some sort, but it's just paying attention to that, because there is something really about the nature of the airwaves that in an American system, the preamble talks about, the common good. We talk about the commonwealth, and this is all about the commons, the nature of the commons, and that the commons belong to we the people, i.e. those people that we're the ones who established the government. We established the state. We established the idea of the public sector. We, the private people, did that. And thus things like the airwaves, and this is well known, they actually belong to us. And the government is stewarding our airwaves for us, allegedly. And then that is then licenses to utilize our commons, our invisible commons, our communicative commons, are then laid out for these corporations. And of course, we were already in trouble in the United States in terms of the corporate capture of the commons since way before, Rupert Murdoch, Fox, and Rush Limbaugh and all of that. But sparing that history in our own indigenous plutocratic evisceration of the best of the American tradition that was already there in the run-up to Fox, Murdoch, and Limbaugh, there is the heightening of that politically then reaches its zenith in Donald Trump.
That's I would say that's a pretty strong assessment. And you mentioned a couple things. You mentioned Oklahoma City. Let's remember, Rush Limbaugh was almost like, at least like in the controlled public narrative, was a sort of like a public enemy number one, kind of a boogeyman who could be used like it was the rhetoric of Rush Limbaugh that caused Oklahoma City. I mean, you had that narrative going on in the early 90s when it was Rush Limbaugh's rabble rousing against like the in the early 90s, it led to the Republicans, basically the Council for National Policy, power structure within the conservative movement, publicly led by Newt Gingrich, taking over the House. It was in the Republicans taking control of Congress, I believe, for the first time in at least 40 years, and that was Rush Limbaugh, that from propaganda perspective, that led the way on that. But even back in the 90s, he was being, I would say, willingly being used as a boogeyman to be blamed for the controlled official narrative of Oklahoma City, that the domestic terrorists in Oklahoma City were inspired by the combination of his show and the Turner Diaries, the book written by the domestic terrorists and militias were inspired by Rush Limbaugh and William Pierce, the author of the Turner Diaries. So, I mean, it's quite a 1-2 punch there. But Limbaugh, the point is, Limbaugh being used as that boogeyman, setting himself up for that as early as going back all the way back to 25 years ago. And the parallels between now and then, I mean, we hope we're wrong, and maybe you hope you're wrong about this, but the parallels between now and then are pretty, unfortunately, pretty. Are definitely, I would say, reason for, we're staying concerned and vigilant about what we see as parallels between now and then. So anyway, let's getting back into some of the other things you mentioned about Rush Limbaugh. It's very interesting that I look at him as, it's interesting because, Limbaugh, it's interesting because, like, where he's somebody who was publicly, I mean, just the things he said, he was a very odious figure for the things he said on air. I mean, he said a lot of very nasty and very, I would say, evil, downright cruel, evil things about a lot of people over the years on his show. And so he was disliked by a large portion of the public because of the way he treated people and the way he acted. And I will say, having cancer, you don't wish cancer, don't wish pain on anyone, but I mean, having cancer does not change who you are as a person. And I mean, the matter of fact, he spent the last months of his life doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down on the same lies that he had told for 3 decades. And his last big public act on the radio was to compare the January 6th insurrection to the revolutionaries, the founding of, taking it back to the spirit of 1776. Very Alex Jones light in that regard, actually. So, but he was known for being a very nasty person in the way he talked about people and the things he said. And in a way, it's interesting because a lot of that goes to these culture wars that we largely look at as a very manufactured, very artificial entity that is very much a divide and conquer. I would say the coining of the phrase culture wars and the perpetuation of it is very much a culturally and it splits people apart rather than brings them together, puts them in partisan boxes, and further, I think, divides our society. And Rush Limbaugh playing a key role in that. And it takes away, it takes away from, like, what I think is the real worst aspects of Limbaugh's legacy, which was the being the man in the ears of middle America, selling you the worst of the Bush era, post September 11th lies, and being the man to convince middle America that anyone who doesn't support Bush's noble war in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere are just anti-Americans who hate their country and want to side with terrorists. And
did Limbaugh lead the way in terms of the attack on the Dixie Chicks?
I'm not sure if Limbaugh specifically did, but he definitely played a major role in that. Limbaugh is also, let's also remember, around this time he was pushing Club Gitmo, comparing Guantanamo Bay to a resort, and I mean, he did a lot of I don't know if he led the way on Dixie Chicks, but he certainly played a role in terms of the vilification of the Dixie Chicks for their opposition to the Iraq War.
Yes, and and we've noticed the rehabilitation under the false flag anti-war rhetoric of Donald Trump of these characters who are all, all down with the Iraq War when it was most important. So people like Limbaugh, but also people who are still trucking and bartering in the horseshoe with the alleged progressive and liberal left, Tucker Carlson.
Yes. Tucker Carlson for sure. And also out there in there as well, Laura Ingraham, who actually wrote a book during the Bush era called Shut Up and Sing, telling all the liberal celebrities who opposed
Like
the
the Dixie
noble,
Chicks, right? She was actually
yes,
talking to the Dixie Chicks,
who
yeah.
opposed the noble Bush War on Terror to shut up and sing, and now it's interesting. More people pay attention to Tucker. I think Tucker's got a bit of the higher platform. He's more provocative, but at the same time, Laura Ingraham, who herself is a protege of David Horowitz. Laura Ingraham is now pushing.
Oh, I didn't realize that Laura Ingraham was a protege of David Horowitz.
I mean, at least one of her, and to some extent, I mean, she
Interesting.
She was making the rounds at David Horowitz's big yearly conference in the early '90s. So I mean, she comes out of that milieu. But Laura Ingraham most recently, has been promoting a left-right unity, populist unity to one of the planks of her unity platform is to end the endless wars, end the forever wars. And so in that regard, she's hosting people like Glenn Greenwald and Tulsi Gabbard on a semi-regular basis, very similar to what Tucker Carlson's doing. So there has been that rebranding, but it's all still the same network, all the way from a Rush Limbaugh and a Sean Hannity to Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham. It's all the same people. I mean, whereas now the woman who wrote the book telling the liberal celebrities to, regularly vilifying the liberal celebrities for their opposition to the wars, and then also the man who referred to, Iraqis as a primitive. I'm paraphrasing here. Primitive savages basically are now they're now rebranded. So that's another extension of, it's another aspect of this that's at play. But Limbaugh definitely was involved with the whole Dixie Chicks, if you ask, the vilification of them. And
Greg, this is a crucial point because I'll let this go for the time being, but I just want to point out that the Iraq War is in many ways the apex of the Fox News operation. And many people point to, obviously, Dick Cheney's office, the connection with the Office of Special Plans, Douglas Feith, the Neocon terror cell there that helped manufacture the intelligence, people like Michael Ledeen, the ties back into Moscow's secret weapon, Ariel Sharon, back in a similar kind of situation in Israel. There was like an attached cell to their normal security apparatus. And then people point to Judith Miller and the New York Times, rightfully so. Judith Miller was the most important sort of key, quote unquote, journalist. And just reminding people that she played the role of journalist in the Dark Winter the war game in the run up to September 11th, Dark Winter, about a biowarfare attack on the United States of America. And you have even people like James Woolsey, who's recently come up with a very, very strange book with the recently deceased KGB colonel, I can't remember, Pachepa, about how it was Khrushchev who ordered Lee Harvey Oswald to assassinate Kennedy. But Woolsey in the Dark Winter exercise played the role of the CIA director, just as he had been formerly, I think.
Pachepa was actually a general in the Securitate, the secret police of communist Romania.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thank you.
So Pachepa was Romanian. He was in the Eastern Communist Bloc, but he was the highest ranking defector from the former Eastern Bloc. And he just died on February 14th. So that's okay. So that's interesting that Miller and the New York Times, we've talked about this before. She's also getting her information, as alleged in it was New York Magazine by Franklin Foer.
Okay, thank you, Greg. From Michael Maloof, who was also in the Office of Special Plans, very close with Feith. And then it has become a darling or a long-term asset of Russia Today, but also the New Horizon conference in Iran, too, with sort of alternative media. And so Maloof was apparently feeding Miller some of this information. And
that's a hell of an accusation to just come up with out of thin air, especially at that time. So, I mean, I'm inclined to believe that Franklin Foer had a very good reason to report that.
And as far as we know, no one has actually asked Malouf that direct question, or let alone like asked him to come to do some penance for his role in probably the worst single foreign policy act of the 21st century of any country, but definitely for the United States.
And as we talked about when we in our previous episode from, I believe, June of 2019, we'll link it when we post our show, when I post our program. When we discussed Michael Malouf in depth, we played a clip of him on RT, on a program on RT, sitting next to Philip Giraldi, the former CIA analyst, who's very critical of Israel's influence, in many cases domination of American policy. And he had Michael Malouf, instead of did he criticize and expose his former colleagues at OSP and within that whole wing? No, what he did instead was blame the liberal intelligence community for pushing the Iraq war, and like almost portrayed him and his clique as being like the people who tried to get good information to the liberal deep state CIA suits, but instead were rejected. When in reality, what I'm thinking was probably going on is that, yeah, that was probably the case, but aspects within the American intelligence community were blocking out the propaganda that was coming from this network, which was even more nefarious than what you would normally get. That's my guess. But it's interesting when he had a chance to push back into say, we were wrong to do this. But no, instead he blames the CIA, basically.
The CIA and the Democrats, really.
It's the insinuation that the same people who are now trying to frame Trump with all this fake Russia stuff or the same people who got us into Iraq. I mean, which is, by the way, another tie-in back to Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh also did that over the last few years. He went from being a vociferous, Iraq cheerleader in the last couple of years, was pushing the narrative that the deep state tricked Bush, the deep state Democrats and intelligence community tricked Bush into going to war in Iraq, and are now also trying to destroy Trump. So it's another parallel back to Rush Limbaugh's way of explaining the.
Well, thank you for bringing that back around, because my original point in this is that everyone always points to the New York Times, but if you really think, and they played a key. I'd say they played a key intelligence role. They were the ones who gave credibility to the fraudulent war criminal intelligence that was used to do the biggest crime of the 21st, single biggest crime in terms of that kind of state action of the 21st century. That was the New York Times. However, if you think about the actual campaign, the media campaign, it wasn't just about the origination of the falsified intelligence that was manufactured. It was then who drove the country to war, who drove the middle of the country to war, who continued to drive, folks on farms from Nebraska to Iowa to Missouri to Kansas to think that it was vital to send their sons and daughters to war. It was Fox News. It was Rush Limbaugh. These were the people who were instrumental in the maintenance of the media quote unquote relations in terms of the Iraq war. And, we won't go deep into it, but we have identified the Iraq war and the expansion of the clean break wars, referring to the 1996 clean break white paper delivered to Netanyahu right as he comes in, delivered the office by Arthur Finkelstein and his network, the same people who put Trump mainstreamed into the Republican Party too. So they remember that continuity there. But that in general, these wars look like they did not actually serve American foreign policy. Obviously, they did not. We always take first and foremost a moral stance on these issues in terms of the impact on the Iraqi people and the people of the Middle East. Go look at the Jewish Australian statistician Gideon Polia's look at the overdeath statistics that basically it's definitely 5 million direct deaths in what we could call the Muslim world as a consequence of the wars on terror, and up into dozens of millions of overdeath in quote unquote side effects of these wars. And so at the same time as the direct moral impact in terms of the death and destruction of human lives, it's also obviously was the worst American foreign policy decision in the 21st century. It's so obvious, even the way it plays domestically. It helped the rise of Trump too, of course, where he could play the role of the guy who's against the bad wars.
Remember, Donald Trump almost single-handedly destroyed the Bush political family by playing on the Bush support for Iraq war.
Yes. And remember, it's so interesting too that, Obama comes in. Obama's the guy who gets his talking points from Richard Haass from the Council on Foreign Relations about the difference between wars of choice and wars of necessity, right? So that's how Obama broke it down, where Afghanistan, based on an alleged Al-Qaeda instituted, engineered Osama bin Laden attack on September 11th from the hills of Afghanistan, that's the war of necessity. And then the war of choice is Iraq. And what's so interesting is that then ultimately fits into other people down the road, including Trump, basically, who plays a sort of right approach to it. And he even said this on Alex Jones when he went on Alex Jones, that the problem with the wars is that they were stupid, and that it's similar to what we heard from reports that this is the way he thought about military men and women as losers at some level. And the reason he saw it as losers is because we didn't go and grab the oil and the minerals in Afghanistan and in Iraq directly. And so it was a sort of, it's a different approach to the issue of the war of choice, war of necessity, a bad war and a good war, or a loser war and a winner war. But it was a similar kind of thing. And so in many ways, the obviously bad, everyone agreed, other than the hardcore neocon cell that still agree that it was a good choice. People like Bolton, who Trump took on too. Other than them, basically everyone else is living in reality, the reality-based world that Karl Rove sneered at so badly. Everyone else living in the reality-based world knows that war resulted in purely negative foreign policy and state blowback for the United States of America. And the more our research comes into focus, it looks like it looks similar to us as what was architected for the Soviets in Afghanistan in terms of a alluring of an empire to sort of double down and fold in on itself because of overextension. So that's just an impression that we get from the nature of these wars. And so that's why we're asking this question: is Limbaugh, Fox, were they just tools of an American Malaise who took advantage of the whittling away of American public mind, public decency, public political ethics, or were they the actual operatives of some kind of hybrid warfare intergenerationally based, where such horrible operations on all accounts, such as the Iraq War, were part and parcel of the deliverables that they placed at the doorstep of the American people and the Iraqi people, for example.
When you talk about, you mentioned the not obviously first and foremost, I mean the toll of the massive crime that was committed again in Iraq in particular, and in the Arab world in general, in the Middle East, post September 11th, and also obviously this goes back also to 1991, which appears to, even with things such as the Highway of Death, to have been an equally in terms of stature, the long, obviously it goes back. Also, you have to take the first 1991 Desert Storm into consideration as well, in terms of the long-term just mass murder committed against in Iraq, in terms of going from Desert Storm and the Highway of Death to the long-term sanctions. Of course, if you want to bring in the criminality of the neoliberal American foreign policy establishment, Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes openly, this was the right thing to do. The price was worth it to starve 500,000 children to death. And then obviously then it picks up and leads into the mass war crime committed under the Bush administration. So, but then also we do have to look at, especially when we look at the influence of these pseudo-patriotic, pseudo-conservative that do not represent actual, principled American conservatism. I think that's a point we're going to try to make over the course of this. You'd also have to look at the effects of this on a domestic scale, because these were the people, it was the Rush Limbaughs, and it was the folks at Fox News, the Hannitys and the Bill O'Reillys, et cetera, who wrapped themselves around in the flag and carried themselves as they were the epitomization of American patriotism post September 11th. And this is what we had to do. This was the noble objective, to punish the people who who killed our people on September 11th and want to continue killing us. And I do think it's important to look at the domestic. I mean, there's a lot of domestic consequences. Perhaps maybe a future, something to do in the future. It'll be interesting to look at this full scale, going from Bush to Obama to Trump and even to the current moment. It might be interesting to do a longer form conversation on the repercussions and consequences of that still faces to this day from Iraq. I think there's a lot of them. It'll make for an interesting conversation. But one aspect, I just think about this in the fact that you had the wrapping around of the flag, and also we're the military's best friend. We love our military. We love our troops. We're waving them off to fight, and we're going to fight anyone who dares say that this is not a noble objective for our troops involved in. Meanwhile, I mean, tell me what good came out of this war in Iraq for the American military. I mean, how many American military personnel came home, if not dead, or came home in body bags, came home scarred and mentally scarred for life as a result of this. And I still remember that disgusting display of George Bush at the White House press correspondence dinner, searching under the table for the weapons of mass destruction. Well, they've got to be
under
somewhere.
here? They're not under here.
Yeah, and while the Hannitys and the Limbaughs are cheering off the Americans to war, it's almost like a modernized, updated version of singing off the Americans into World War II. Onward, Christian soldiers. I believe that was the song to send the American boys off to Europe, into Asia in World War II. It's a modern day update on that, but very much with the modern technology of mass media in 2000s, being able to portray yourself as the best friend of the military because you host country singers who make patriotic songs and all this and that. But meanwhile, the effects on our military personnel, and that's another thing that Donald Trump came in and swooped in on, was the politicians don't care about the military because all of the VA's in horrible condition, our veterans aren't being taken care of. Well, something that exacerbated the negative condition of American veterans, American military personnel, were these wars that these American military personnel had no business being involved in, the psychological and mental health effects of these wars as well. And so these are things that, the Rush Limbaughs of the world, the Fox News of the world, and waving their American flags and wearing their lapel pins on their suits and telling you that this is the noble and right thing to do, never gave you any type of insight into that. And I mean, it's really disgusting when you really think about it. And it's why, to this day, I'm always going to have a particular distaste for the purveyors of that in that time period, especially when they are the people now. Limbaugh up until recently, and obviously Sean Hannity, people like that, are also leading the way in trying to portray Donald Trump as and then even going back to Laura Ingrams and Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump is this mix of muscular Reagan-esque American assertion in the world, combined with this almost this diet Ron Paul, America shouldn't be the world's policeman, we should be bringing our boys home. And so you see, it's all the same purveyors of this criminal operation that not only had a disastrous effect on people in Iraq and other countries, but also on even our own people here at home in so many ways. I still think there's ways that this affects us, you can even get into economic effects as well. It affected America's standing in the world. I know some people are going to think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what it did was there's a lot of consequences to that when you look at like the push for Trump coming in and reducing America's role in the world. It very much exacerbated the rest of the world, how it felt about America, and seeing America as the world's bully, basically, and all that. So it affected America in so many ways, and yet all these I think war criminal accomplices in the media, the Rush Limbaughs of the world, the Fox Newses of the world, just wave their flags and push this as the most noble objective in history, when in reality, it was a complete disaster on all fronts.
Yeah, and it was very direct too, the Limbaugh Fox influence, and the direct bodily effect, as you referenced, in terms of the Iraq War. Thousands of dead American soldiers, but dozens of thousands with all kinds of bodily trauma that totally transformed their lives for the worse. And you remember, this is part of the idea of that the age of the military man or woman, is that these are people who obviously, at the very least, have some sort of togetherness and a certain amount of physical courage to be willing and able to go and do this kind of thing. So these are a key piece of our people, of we the people, in terms of their capacity, even if you don't even consider the worth of their lives on their own being, in a similar fashion to the worth of the lives on their own, in their own being of the quote unquote other side of the wars. But you also then have the, as you pointed out, psychological influences. We're talking about dozens of thousands. The numbers look like it's like probably approaching 150,000 veteran suicides during these years, these post 9/11 years. And can you chalk up all of that to the effect of a single war? No, I don't think that's.
By the way, Jeremy, I think people it might be instructive for people to go back and look at the story of Thomas Young, the American military veteran who was paralyzed in Iraq, and then eventually came home and was an anti-war protester, and then died several years back. But go back and look at his story of just the way, in terms as a great example of just the real actual nature of what this disaster was like for so many in terms of the effects on our own military, and people who were sent off into this believing that it was the right noble thing to. It may instructive to go back and look once again at the story of Thomas Young and what happened to him. So
thank you very much for referencing him. And I guess the final point in terms of this is that it is I've read that to this day, Fox News is the one that's on in most of the military installations around the country and around the world. So putting those two together, the role of Fox News in the manufacturing and most importantly the maintenance of these horrific wars, and then the fact that they are still on there, and what we know about what they're still doing. So there is something. If you begin to really understand information warfare, hybrid warfare, network warfare, intellectual warfare, then you begin to see, oh my gosh, the actual enemies of the best or the better half of the American tradition are well within the gates. They have taken over our communicative commons, and large portions of crucial aspects of the American mind and political establishment, in terms of, at the very least, talking points, propaganda, and all of that. And so these people, Limbaugh, and remember, we're not only talking about Fox News, right? We're talking about the entirety of talk radio, right? And the AM, the rise of AM radio, which is also the prefactor for Alex Jones to take it then to that next level.
You remember the old quote: "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within."
Yes. And I mean,
I think that epitomizes a lot of this.
and more, you begin to have to look at it with that eye, I think, and Iraq was not something that just America stumbled into. No, it was drawn into it for very specific reasons. And yes, on the surface of it, some of those reasons were very neoconservative politics, very Israeli partisan in terms of these clean break destabilization strategies. And as we pointed out, we're going to do a future room on Clubhouse that is actually what we would title a read along. This is more of like a ride along in terms of us recording a long form show on a specific topic. But we also want to do read alongs where, for example, we'll break out the clean break paper and read it and go over it and see what it actually says. And it calls in 1996, 5 years before September 11th, it calls for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and then the rolling back of Assad in Syria. And so, of course, that's the surface aspect of the geopolitics of the reason for all of that. But even behind that, there's something maybe deeper here that is represented by someone like Rupert Murdoch and the figures of Rush Limbaugh. And maybe for Limbaugh, it's in a way that he doesn't even understand the nature of the asset that he really was.
Yeah, and I think, and we've talked about before, just bringing in, even looking at, like, you can go back to some of our previous shows, and I think we'll elaborate more on this in the future, where we've discussed the idea of the war on terror and of the long-term urge to, basically draw America into an unwinnable quagmire. At the end of the day, is a lot of. I mean, we brought up we brought him up in the past. We're not going to talk about him in depth here, but I'll go back, of course, to Natan Sharansky, the legendary quote unquote Soviet dissident who was George W. Bush's democracy whisperers. This would be the great war that would be used to achieve democracy. And so there's a lot of layers to it. And we've even looked at it in a sense of long-term American global decline, is the way that there were actual, yes, there actually is such thing, actual foreign, actual domestic and international destabilizing factors that looked to benefit from September 11th as a means of, in one way, to their own national benefit. Certain countries, you could point to places such as China for that, for Russia for that, but also looked at September 11th from a long-term operation. I believe even as a means of just as part. You have to also look at as part and parcel of just a long-term destabilization effort in terms of of an operation to weaken the United States, both globally as well as domestically. I mean, I think that a lot of our domestic internal issues have been really perpetuated and exacerbated by the legacy of the Bush era in the Bush wars. There's a lot of layers to that. Do you want to comment on that before we?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can leave the Sharansky depths aside for now. But I think it's crucial to understand that a lot of these people, these prominent, public figures, such as Sharansky, key in both combination of things that are going to play out increasingly now domestically, such as the new anti-Semitism and the usage of the encapsulating speech critical of Israel with being anti-Jewish under the rubric of anti-Semitism. That's going to be escalated right now to control political rhetoric. Not because of anti-Jewish speech or acts, but because of controlling political rhetoric specifically surrounding Israel, ostensibly, right? But the control mechanism is very powerful. So the new anti-Semitism, the modern godfather of the new anti-Semitism is Natan Sharansky. Okay, he's passed it out now, sort of there's a new guard. It goes from Sharansky maybe to Deborah Lipstadt, the Wexner fundee, and sponsored by the Epstein mega group. One of the godfathers, Les Wexner, that's Deborah Lipstadt, multiple decades as the next generation of the leading new anti-Semitism rhetorician, linking those two things. And then maybe people like Barry Weiss actually are maybe the next generation to receive that. And at the same time, as you pointed out, he's the go-to guy for George W. Bush in terms of to name his book as the reasoning behind the push to quote unquote spread democracy in the Middle East. Okay, so that is a very curious character who lies at the epicenter of both of these key destabilization and really, if properly understood, warfare operations on what could become of the United States of America in someone like Natan Sharansky. And it's not as simple as what he seems to be on the surface as some kind of just, Soviet Jewish, immigrant who's made good of himself in Israel. No, go to the last chapters of Red Mafia by Robert Friedman and see what the heck Natan Sharansky was doing with the Russian deep state and the oligarchs and the Russian mob and the money that he brought in at the same time as he came into some of the commanding heights in terms of Israeli society and government. And at the same time, he then rises to the level of the leader of the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is one of the oldest Zionist organizations. And a crucial one even to this day, where some of the people who are speaking out against and using twisted facts and rhetoric against the Saturday Night Live joke by Michael Che about Israel and the Palestinians and vaccines and access and all of that has been spun by a spokesperson formerly of the IDF, but also of the Jewish Agency for Israel and then the American Jewish Committee. So someone like Natan Sharansky, there is a much deeper background. And then we would just, say, and I won't go into it, but I'll pass it back to you, but of people like James Angleton, head of the Israel desk at the Central Intelligence Agency, head of counterintelligence in the U.S. intelligence community, or people like Henry Kissinger. Okay. This seems like it sounds like a crazy movie, but the facts are just beneath the surface to look at, and they help explain a lot geopolitically that doesn't seem to work out until you begin to factor in that some of these people are not exactly who they appear to be.
Indeed. And I guess just to finish up on the war criminal propaganda aspect of this, is that these criminal wars would not have been nearly as successful as they were without Fox News and without Rush Limbaugh, and Rush Limbaugh really being that guy who could level with and speak to the middle American conservative. And it's interesting because once again, this lack of understanding of the neocon split, as we've called it, in the fact that like those who were still wanted to play up this idea of like Trump was somehow opposed to the neocons and neocon wars and all this, that Trump was somehow outside that milieu, they would simply focus on like the never Trumpers. Well, tell me this. Who did more to make the Iraq war a success, or, in terms of the way like the Bush administration wanted it to be? Who was more influential in that? Bill Kristol, Jennifer Rubin, David Frum? That's I think that's a part of this legacy that's at play here. But that middle America, much like if Lyndon Johnson lost Walter Cronkite, he lost middle America. If Bush didn't have Rush Limbaugh on the air, Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, would he have had middle America in his pocket for the wars? I mean, I don't know if there would have been quite as many young American men in the middle America post 9/11 in a patriotic fervor rushing to sign up and go to war. So I think that is how you have to look at this and their, I would say, disastrous effect in terms of the legacy of the post September 11th war and the world and the wars that took place in America's name that did so much damage, both internationally but also domestically here at home, and we can't lose sight of that.
Greg, will you go back over briefly the neocon split, because we first started discussing that in the first year of Trump, actually.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So what we identified, because one of the key things, this is another key aspect of what brought Donald Trump into that won him so much support among a war-weary public. I mean, you got to remember, America was very war-weary. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump, the way that Trump went after the Bush family, Jeb Bush, but the Bush family in general, was to play upon and to really hype up and to really hammer home Bush's, Jeb Bush's brother being the person who got us into the Iraq War, among other things. But and so that was used with the combination of a lot of, I would say, not really anti-war, not really anti-intervention rhetoric, but was pushed that way nonetheless by Trump and people who promoted on his behalf this idea that Donald Trump was opposed to the neocons, he was opposed to hawkish neoconservative foreign policy. And what we've identified, we started to put this together, I'd say, during the first year of the Trump presidency, is that there was much more to the neocons than people, I think, realized. And the way, once again, I mentioned those names before, like Bill Kristol and David Frum, and I didn't mention Robert Kagan, but you could throw him in there in that category as well. When people think of neoconservative, they think of those names. And you even, to a lesser extent, you also think of people like Paul Wolfowitz, but mainly from you think of, I think for me, like the prototypical neoconservative. If I heard that term 4 or 5 years ago, I would have immediately thought of Bill Kristol.
Bill Kristol, yeah.
Yes, it's that never Trump, the never Trumpers like Kristol and
David Frum, yeah.
That people think of. But, and Max Boot, you can throw him in there as well, people like that. But ultimately, though, also at the same time as all this is going on, you have there's a whole nother set of what you could call, what I would term as neoconservatives, who in many cases are even more fanatically hawkish on, say, a country, when it comes to countries such as Israel, than even the Bill Kristols and the Frums and the Kagans. And this aspect has never really been focused on and zeroed in upon as nearly as much as it should have. And this contingent largely supported Donald Trump. And I would say that it's a combination of really, these were the people who were, in many cases, certainly in the case of people like David Wurmser, aforementioned David Wurmser, right there leading the push within the Cheney vice president's office for the push for the propaganda, which led to the Iraq War. So you have people like that combined with also what we've identified as this long-term nest of neoconservatives going all the way back to people such as Richard Pearl out of Henry Scoop Jackson's office, the senator from Boeing in Washington, to proteges of Richard Pearl and colleagues of his such as Frank Gaffney and Michael Ledeen, among others. And so you have this whole other contingent of American neoconservatives that have not been focused on, that arguably did more directly to push America to the brink of war in Iraq than these other class of neoconservatives who people have come to identify with that term neoconservative. And that's not at all to downplay or lessen to the extent of their own depths of complicity in this criminal war, but at the same time, that also does not discount that there was another contingent that maybe at the end of the day even more hawkish than this, and that's what was missing. And this was very much epitomized under Trump, whereas some of these people even move on to places such as Breitbart and Steve Bannon and people like Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka, who combined like this very hawkish hawkish mentality when it came to support for Israel, when it came to U.S. policy against Iran, but also at the same time pushing the idea that Donald Trump's against the forever wars and against the neocons. And Steve Bannon, the purveyor, the public face of the Cambridge Analytica mass warfare operation, was regularly attacking the neocons and pushing the pseudo anti-war mentality, while still at the end of the day in bed with the, I would say, what are many of the most extreme of the hawks, and not just even of like the war on terror, like this idea of like whatever bringing democracy or whatever, like Bill Kristol, people like that claim to believe in, but actually at its core that this is actually a war on terror, the meaning that it's actually a war against, ultimately, I think the bigger term for it would be a clash of civilizations, where it's actually like a clash between the values of radical Islam and the people of versus the values of they love to call it the Judeo-Christian West. So ultimately, you have this idea of these neocons, and it's simply like this nest of people who don't like Donald Trump, but it's so much deeper than that. And
yeah, I mean, like, for example, we have no evidence that someone like Bill Kristol, for example, actually helped manufacture the falsified intelligence for the Iraq War. There are indicators that Michael Ledeen did that. Similarly, in a way that he was at the epicenter of Iran-Contra making moves.
At the very least, I will say that his the Bill Kristol on Fox News, as well as his publication, The Weekly Standard, was definitely a platform for the people that you're describing now. But in terms of direct facilitating of the evidence, I don't think there's any evidence for that.
Right. They obviously, meaning Kristol, what we call them the paleo neocons, like a paleo conservative, but a paleo neoconservatives are those who were obsessed with what they called the unipolar moment, the end of history, referencing Fukuyama. And they actually believed in the project for a new American century, and that they actually wanted it to extend the American reach in the world. They were obviously so entangled with a certain kind of Israeli partisanship that was most obviously tied up with the hardline Likud, that it made it difficult to disentangle exactly where their real motives lay. But I think that they really were they believed in the unipolar moment, and they believed in these to take it. They were the ones who would say, what's the use of a military if you don't use it, right? And so they saw America needs to spring to action, and they had no creative ideas beyond just sending the military into Iraq. And remember, even it was the Kagans, it was Donald and Fred Kagan on C-SPAN on September 12th of 2001, who were the ones who were calling for American troops on the ground in the occupied territories in Palestine.
Great point. And this difference, I think, was very much conveyed. And I would also throw in John Bolton in the Trump administration. People just called him a neocon, but I mean, even John Bolton was not like the typical Bill Kristol style neocon. I mean, no, John Bolton was very much closer to the interests of, I think, the types of people we're describing now, largely staged, manufactured, artificial feud dispute with Trump, where John Bolton didn't actually really expose anything damning about Trump aside. I mean, John Bolton was very much closer to this milieu of these of what we're describing here with what we termed as the paleo neocons. And I think there's a good example of this split we're talking about. I can't remember the date, but I believe it was sometime in 2018 or 2019, Robert Kagan posted an op-ed in the Washington Post about where he's even expressing concern about Israel moving away from the United States as its protector in terms of the of an America that it's a combination of a lamenting of like America moving in the direction of like more totalitarian figures, moving more into the direction of people such as people such as Vladimir Putin in Russia, but also a lamenting of Israel losing its traditional ally. And the way Robert Kagan described it is exactly as you put it, in terms of like Israel needs a strong America that stands for democratic values and a strong America that is basically in the position of global leadership. And
it's almost like at that moment, it seemed like Robert Kagan and Bernie Sanders were actually part of another crew that were highly suspicious of the international fascist order or authoritarian order, as Sanders might have called it.
You've even now got as prominent of a Jewish American as David Rothkopf, the publisher of Foreign Policy magazine, tweeted there over the summer that that Israel is not entitled. Basically, Israel is not entitled to American aid and protection. So that's even another level compared to like what we're talking about now, because none of these I don't think any of these people we're discussing now in the Crystal Kagan milieu would ever say that. But that's the level of like where even like prominent like American Jewish figures within the foreign policy establishment, such as David Rothkopf, publicly saying that, is a pretty big example. But it represents this actual like American centric. When I say American centric, it's not yours or mine's ideal. It's probably not our ideal American centric policy, but it is a policy nonetheless, and it is an ideology that relies upon an actual like strong America in terms of like a strong American global presence. And ultimately, as much as like these Bill Kristols and Robert Kagans, etc., are very passionate, I would say, and there's a loyalty to Israel, probably stemming from their own Jewishness. Ultimately, they aspire to see a world where, with the quote unquote American global leadership, where America is the power that's in. What was it that it's like actually fulfilling what Bill Clinton was supposedly quoted as saying to Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly? We're the fucking superpower here.
Who's the fucking superpower? Yeah,
right. And so it's.
That's an important. This is really an important distinction, because this is the rising question, one of the most major rising questions of the moment in terms of the Jewish American mind. And speaking from my own Jewish American mind, I am a Jewish American patriot of conscience, and I feel I've never been to Israel, but my sense is that the natural homelands of the modern Jewish people in terms of the West is Brooklyn, New York, and the Jewish people have been the safest in the United States of America as they've been in any country in the entire world, in entire history, really. And so that is a major split here. So when you begin to see such sort of prominent Jewish, public figures, like people like Rothkopf, and even like people like Kagan, who was expressing it in a different way in terms of Israel beginning to pivot to its patronage to the East. And that's, of course, the national security question is, Russia, China, the technology question, the back door of the technology question, cybersecurity, the transfer of Silicon Valley assets and very large research and development assets to Israel. And that's why we've focused so much in terms of the deep history of like someone like Jonathan Pollard and how it did not stop. It was maybe not even primarily at some level just about certain papers that the Israeli national security establishment wanted, but there were some very deep aspects that connected it with Soviet intelligence, and in very dangerous ways, it looks like, too. So there is that aspect, like where Rothkopf is very frontal about it in terms of, who, like in that Clintonian kind of speech that you pointed out, who the fuck is the superpower here? But of course, the background, and this, I think, gets us back into the questions of like the rise of Limbaugh and Fox News, which really, really comes into play in the 90s, not only during the Clinton administration, but also in the rise of the end of the Clinton administration and the impeachment and the rise of Drudge as basically coming out of a phoenix, out of that, the ashes.
And let's remember that, even people, Rush Limbaugh, I believe, you can go back and you can look. I don't know how often you mentioned Matt Drudge by name, but that entire conservative media sphere, going all the way back to Lewinsky scandal and the rise of Drudge, very much relied upon the stories that were on the headlines on DrudgeReport.com for their own narratives. So.
And Drudge, and from everyone from Alex Jones to Rush Limbaugh, they both really named Drudge a lot up until very recent years. And, you know, so, and I think it is important to see Alex Jones as a next generation or a, you know, next iteration of Rush Limbaugh, who obviously came into his full archetype during Trump. But then back in the 90s, the reason that popped into my mind about Clinton and who is the superpower here is that right beneath the scenes there. So on top of it, you have what, you know, Hillary Clinton called the vast right wing conspiracy that not only included the, you know, propaganda via Fox and Rush, but also the Richard Mellon Scaife network, which really it was some of the earlier run up to things like even like QAnon at some level. You could see it as a pre-generational QAnon at some level in terms of the Scaife network. But as Clinton sits in the White House, you have AMDOCs, basically Israeli military intelligence, being set up in the White House communication system so that when Lewinsky and Clinton are dallying around, Clinton says, or maybe this is on the phone, he says, there's someone might be listening, right? And so Clinton knew at that point that the Israelis had basically been allowed to have access to White House comms. And AMDOCS, by the way, was run back through to its St. Louis American headquarters in Missouri, and then it apparently directly back to Israel.
Yeah, and on top of that, Bill Clinton also publicly mentioned that it was the immigrating to Israel of all of these Russians, these people the people out of the former Soviet Union that were the biggest roadblock and impediment to quote unquote peace as well. So, so a lot of factors there with Clinton. And to finish up on the neocon split, basically, I think what it comes down to is you've got when it comes to Israel and when it comes to other things as well, and this is vitally and crucially important from a perspective of both like what we see as the very real aspects of a 2016 collusion, not just Russiagate, but very much on a global scale, is this conversation of like the American, ultimately at the end of the day, you know, want to see an America world controlled by American military and economic power, in America with still the strong, quote unquote, democratic institutions of the post-war world. And while they may have their issues with aspects of the United Nations and aspects of the European Union and all that, ultimately, I don't think that these types want to destroy that. And they very much see a globe that is American global primacy, and no country, including Israel, is going to basically supplant the American global presence. And a strong Israel is going to be perpetuated through a strong American presence, basically the Americans as the protectors of Israel. But then on that, outside of that, though, I think this other wing comes into play, which ultimately does not care. Ultimately is not completely all about just simply that does not want just America, like the America leading this world, this order of democratic nations and institutions around the globe. I mean, these are people who have open disdain for institutions such as the United Nations and the European Union and the rule of law, democracy. And in some ways, it's very twisted, but it still represents some semblance of that. And there's a strong disdain shared by this aspect of American neoconservatives that also very much is shared by both Russia and Israel. I mean, you can see a very common disdain for these established institutions. I think that plays out in everything from the push for Brexit, which very much was a global operation, very much a precursor to Trump in terms of the aspects involved in that, from oligarchs and organized crime money to the role of Israeli propaganda outlet Breitbart, conceived in Israel at the table desk of Benjamin Netanyahu, playing the key role in terms of setting up shop in London during the precursor to Brexit. And everything from Brexit to policy as it relates to Iran, as it relates even to the war in Syria, is this desire to actually lessen in many ways American global influence, especially if it's seen as maybe being to the benefit of Israel. And that's one of the areas where Benjamin Netanyahu, I mean, he certainly relies upon American politicians being extremely supportive of Israel to a fault, but also obviously wanted the American military might to be used in Iraq. But at the same time, ultimately is not, I believe, is actually a force and a factor that actually wants to weaken American global power. But ultimately, Netanyahu and this particular clique of American neoconservatives, they're much closer, I think, ideologically. In many cases, actually encourage like a lessening of an American global role. And we could talk all day about the merits, the pluses and minuses of that. We kind of did that in our last show where we discussed the article by Alfred McCoy, While You Were Sleeping, America's waking up to America basically being, I forget the exact title, but waking up from a dream to find American global power gone, basically. And so that is, I think, the crux of this. And it's a huge aspect to so many of our domestic politics, as well as our global geopolitics, is this vision of the neoconservatives who see an American, a world controlled by American might and power versus those who don't really care if America loses that. And when it comes to factors such as Israel, are perfectly fine with other foreign entities, maybe countries from the East stepping in and replacing the American role in the Middle East in particular, but globally in general, if it's to their own benefit. So that's where I see this is, and we've expounded upon this form, we should continue expounding upon it as time goes on. But I think this is really gets to the crux of the split of the neoconservatives as we've tried to identify it over the last 4 years.
Well, thank you for delving into that, Greg. And two last things that I would add to that. And one is, maybe we can get back to that in order to get back to Limbaugh and finish up on Limbaugh, is the purposeful and public evisceration of even the guise of civil and or democratic and or human rights discourse. And you notice this immediately, Greg, that the neocons on the side of the split towards Trump were basically taking off the mask in terms of their anti-Islam stance, really, and as you pointed out, a sort of an opening up of the rhetoric against the savagery of another civilization, as it was implicated in many ways. And the paleo neocons, the Crystals and the Kagans and all of them, and not judging whether they meant it. I think in many cases they do actually mean it, because they feel they are Americans. They feel most comfortable in sort of liberal democracies, and so they want to promote that they, at the very least on the surface, they would advocate for, this is not a war, as George W. Bush said, this is not a war against Islam. And so that was then eviscerated by this sort of harder line neocons who went with the Trump side into basically a taking off of the human rights democratic mask. And I think you pointed that out very early on. And I think in a longer term fashion, someone like Rush Limbaugh was a crucial leader in the devolution of domestic American political discourse in terms of stripping down at least the guise or the structural approach to civility, and over many, 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 many years. But before passing it back to you in terms of that, Greg, I just wanted to point out operationally again, someone like Michael Ledeen, in a way that's highly distinct from the Crystals and the Kagans, who basically mainly just, sit in their think tanks and do their writing and their speaking and all of that. Ledeen gets active. It looks like he was involved in the manufacturing of the intelligence in a way, and people can go look at the background there. It looks like he skipped around the Central Intelligence Agency in relationship to the manufacturing of the 2003 Iraq War intelligence falsification. And then that is then followed up in terms of the closeness of not only Michael Ledeen, but his wife, Barbara Ledeen, in terms of the Trump administration. And Barbara worked with, I think, or works with Chuck Grassley, and very, very, very much in the mix in terms of the actual attempt to undermine the investigation into Trump Russia. And as we pointed out over and over again on the Antedote, that in the background of Trump Russia is Trump Russia, Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and in many ways it was that mainly that Israeli, deep background of the Trump installation operation that acted as the control lever to make sure that even across the aisle and to the Democrats, that there was a strong motivation to keep it contained. And as Rod Rosenstein said, I can land this plane. And then after they land the plane, i.e. Mueller passed the Barr at some level, or Barr interrupting Mueller, or whatever the way the mechanisms of all of that, the thing was not fully, dug out. Definitely not the Middle East component was not dug out. And then Rosenstein basically ends up becoming the legal counsel for Israeli military intelligence cyber weapon contractor, the NSO group, who was intimately involved in supplying the Pegasus weaponry that looks like it was directly delivered to someone like Amazon's Jeff Bezos on his phone by the MBS. And then also, of course, in the lead up to the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes. And thanks for filling that in. And going full circle to the domestic aspect of the Limbaugh legacy, I think is very much carried out through Fox News and pretty much the entire quote unquote conservative media milieu, all the way from still to this day Fox News, ranging to Alex Jones and so much of more conspiracy, even QAnon oriented media, going all the way to the two aspects of the American alt-right, with Limbaugh playing such a key roles we're going to talk about here. On the domestic side of things, I brought up earlier the how the Limbaugh's penchant for controversy and for saying provocative and in many cases really cruel things about people, I think in a lot of ways served as a distraction away from like the negative effects of like the of Limbaugh's selling of things such as war, and his bigger overall impact in terms of the way the narrative was actually. I think the New York Times and all of this eulogizing of Limbaugh as like this key figure in the culture wars never really identified that. I think there have been other more serious commentators who have identified like the actual effects of like Limbaugh's discourse domestically of the American mind. But it is important to understand at the same time like the this aspect of the Limbaugh personality, because I think what it did was as we talked about at the very beginning, this is something that's been in play. This is not, I think this ultimately, I would say what's had a very, very negative effect on actual American conservatism, any actual semblance of what would be a principled American conservatism, conservative philosophy, etc., have really been bastardized in a very negative and detrimental manner. I mean, I think this does, at the very least, in terms of our modern conversation, does go back to the rise of the John Birch Society and the New Right in the 60s, and then on from there through the rise of the Council for National Policy in the 1980s. But Rush Limbaugh coming in and being a key purveyor and shaper of what became this narrative. And I think ultimately what you see with like the Rush Limbaugh culture warrior domestic rabble rouser pushing all these narratives, the feminazis and the many of the things he would say from much more dog whistling in terms of racial aspects than more covert than overt, but definitely there in terms of like the way in which aspects such as like government assistance are discussed or nature of crime in this country. But all of that,
But didn't he do the song about Obama, the Magic Negro?
He did do that, and that was one of the more overt cases. Yes, so there was some overtness in there, but ultimately, I think more or less it was more coded in a lot of ways than you would get from other people. But definitely, yes, he did do he did sing on air Barack the Magic Negro about Barack Obama. So that was an overt example, but I think it was more or less more coded than you'd get in a lot of other places. But it certainly showed its overt colors at times. But I think what you have to look at in terms of this aspect of Limbaugh's legacy is that he's the key figure over the last 3 to 4 decades who very much what he did was the way Limbaugh would talk about women and the way he would talk about these social issues was it epitomized I would say like a pseudo representation of like what America's supposed to be and what strong American values actually are, and it's rooted in this reaction. It's rooted in taking advantage, I think, of something that was there among millions of Americans. And I've used relatives in my family who have gone from, as examples of this, who have gone from in the case of my close relative of mine, gone from being a politically apathetic Democrat to a very passionate supporter of Donald Trump. And I think that was in large part, and I can't prove this as I haven't really talked to her about this, but I mean, I think that this is my sense that this is the case, that this was largely be due to a subconscious playing upon a subconscious fear of the changing of their country. And I think Rush Limbaugh did this with millions of people. I think he really played very strongly to a sense of what was ultimately a weaponized patriotism and a weaponized sense of like love of country and a fear of changes in your society, cultural changes, demographic changes. And I think that this is very much something that people in conservative, quote unquote, conservative media in general have gotten very good at. And that is playing on and weaponizing fears of, you're losing the country that you have known and loved, and it's never going to go back to the way it was before, when you were growing up, the older Americans, the boomer generation, etc. And I think that this is something that's really been played upon. And I think that Limbaugh, underneath all the coarseness, at the same time, you have this coarseness in terms of like the way he treated like his real and perceived political opponents, very similar to Donald Trump for that matter. I mean, Rush Limbaugh, the way he talked about people is very similar to Donald Trump. So in that way, Limbaugh is kind of a prototype for Trump in that regard, in terms of they were very similar in the way they talked about people. I think that's very important.
You couldn't have Trump as a public political figure to come to victory in that way without Rush Limbaugh sort of sowing the space or burning the space before him, I think.
That's a good point. And that's a very good point. But in getting into this, though, going back to this, the underneath that coarseness was also a man who presented himself as the best friend of the person who was listening to him. If you were part of his audience, you were his friend, and he spoke to you like you were a guest in his own home. And
ditto, Greg.
Yes, and you were, my friends. He was your best friend, and it felt like you were friends with him. He felt, and so. Underneath that, I think that's a very, very powerful. That's a very, very powerful aspect of the Limbaugh legacy, is that in appealing to his audience and the way he did, I don't think anybody can replace that. I think there would be other people who have influence, but never to like that extent of like the way Limbaugh had like this captivating hold over so much of his audience. But with that, I think what he did, and this was the single most important aspect of his legacy, and I think other people have really picked up on this and mastered this, maybe not to the same extent he did, but have certainly gotten good at it, is playing upon this, building a pseudo, I believe, an alternative reality of like what the sense of a fear of losing what you had and going back to the way things were, and the way things were, or the way, like, Limbaugh et al. Make out America to once being is the way it's supposed to be. And any type of like actual change in your, like any type of like societal change is akin to a complete destruction of your society. And so I think this is the legacy from a domestic perspective, from a bigger picture, combination of the destabilizing that took place through the perpetuation of the culture wars and the continued further stoking of division from the right side of things, combined with this taking advantage of a reactionary sentiment that was there, I think, for many years, ready to be exploited particularly within Middle America, but really taken to the to a very prominent level by a Rush Limbaugh, who came in and took advantage of fears that many people may not even realize that they had about the changes in society, and really turned it into a big time, a major propaganda effort, emotional effort to appeal to the sense that your country's never going to be the same again. You're losing your country, and we must save it through this reactionary element that any type of change, for better or for worse, is going to. So that's what I think his legacy ultimately lies in, and that very much in the aspect of this that we see as like the stabilizing asset of that is through using things such as the culture wars and the changing of your society to really play on your worst fears that you're losing everything, and therefore what that ultimately leads you to is to the Donald Trumps of the world and everything that's happened since then. So,
and I guess the last point that I would like to make about the Limbaugh political legacy is actually about his influence on economic discourse, especially as we see at some way the timing of the death of Limbaugh with the disaster in Texas that rightfully should be put at the feet of so-called privatization, but it's really our version of plutocratic corporatization. And that's a serious categorical error that basically almost everybody in our country makes to this day, is confusing the private with the corporate. The private is we, the people. That's us as individuals. We're the people. We created the government. We sit over the government. We give the government any legitimate power that it has. The government then, under our legitimacy, under our delegated powers, then delegates some aspect of legal, immunity to the corporations. They are chartered at the state level. Look at Delaware, the whole background, the history of the corporate charters and all of that. And yet basically the hierarchy of sovereignty, as it's meant to be, the best of the American constitutional tradition, has been turned upside down. And in terms of the political rhetoric and the agitation towards that confusion and the escalation of the plutocratic corporatization of the public sector, of the sort of the mass distrust of the general public sector and of the government, the very few people have been as influential over the decades as Rush Limbaugh in driving that home. And that's in many ways why he really can be seen as the perfect progenitor of Alex Jones, who then takes that, you can't trust the government to a heightened pitch, and that ultimately just economically plays into the corporatization hands of, obviously the Council for National Policy is maybe the institution that represents that the most, and sort of maybe suspended between that and then the Koch network at some level, and the more sort of so-called libertarian approach to it, which really has replaced the American conservatism traditional American economics that have nothing to do with these different European formats, whether Marxism on the left or the Austrian school on the right. We have our own indigenous economic approach here. And this is why I then see everyone from Rush Limbaugh to the entirety of the Fox network as part and parcel of the hybrid warfare against the actual indigenous American economic traditions, which ended up in basically the power for the people of Texas costing $23 billion more over the years, when it was supposedly they'll get a better deal from it by quote unquote privatizing it, actually corporatizing it, inverting the hierarchy of sovereignty. And then also ends up, they were just moments away of a months-long disaster of basically losing their grid capacity. And then the actual human wake of it, of course, is the deaths of people, human beings, whether from freezing or carbon monoxide poisoning. And now, of course, the economic wake of all of that in terms of these, multi-$1,000 bills for, elders who are on Social Security and total, failed state kind of aura, stuff like that. And that is the kind of economics that, of course, it's not just Rush Limbaugh, but really, in terms of the sort of the political warfare aspect of it against the public sector under the guise of the swamp in DC, really, as the boogeyman, there's few people who more consistently pounded on that over the years than Rush Limbaugh.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. And going back even to the mentioning of Alex Jones, it's very interesting because I think from a long-term aspect, also somebody like a Rush Limbaugh, from the way he presented things, like it seemed to me that in the age of Trump, especially, Limbaugh was able to play the role of the person who could take like the rhetoric and the language that was very much being pushed by, Alex Jones, and even all the way from Alex Jones to aspects of QAnon, and promote that to the everyday what we've referred to before, the conservative middle American, and frame that in a way that would not be so too over the top as a means to turn them off. And so I think that, you have the course where it's Limbaugh and Fox News, the pipeline of Limbaugh and Fox News to Alex Jones and QAnon, basically, to where they take the points and almost sanitize them for the portion of the conservative base that's not ready to embrace the more conspiratorial elements, but ultimately sanitizes those narratives and rhetoric to where they, whether they know it or not, are pretty much marching in lockstep with the more openly provocative conspiratorial types of elements of the audiences of Alex Jones and QAnon. So,
yep.
And and what you were saying there, and that's going back to the economic aspect of things. That's a very important conversation to have in terms of what you stated there, and this is not. What you stated there in terms of like the war against any type of like public services or government services in the name of fighting the swamp, and that's very important because and this will be a conversation to have in the future in terms of like even a conversation, an economic conversation in terms of going into even topics related to environmental topics, in addition to energy related topics, is all of the money that goes into very much Rush Limbaugh was a primary voice. Like, I mean, I even over the last year, just as much listening to portions of Limbaugh's show over the last year, I would hear him occasionally singing the praises of a combination of coal, of fracking energy, as well as nuclear energy. So very much a voice, I would say, a very, very financially compensated voice of those industries that, regardless of where one may stand on the merits of whatever types of energy are at question, very much, I think, Limbaugh nonetheless was a very financially well taken care of mouthpiece for those particular interests and their agendas, which go far beyond just a simple conversation about like the merits of certain types of energy and power, and goes into topics way beyond what you're talking about there, such as like the complete dissolution or the desire for a complete dissolution in the name of corporatism of any type of serious government or public efforts to have any type of real influence in our society, all in the name of this is the corruption at play with the federal institutions, and they're destroying everything. And that leads you now to where that leads you into the direction of like the Alex Joneses, to where you go from simply politics, like the liberals are doing this for control, to the liberals are doing this to enslave and kill us all. So
yeah. And so I guess in like answering this just direct question here, for the time being, Limbaugh, Fox, tools of malaise or war, I think we should explore Fox some more down the road. But in terms of Limbaugh, I don't think I would say that consciously he was an agent of war against the United States. So I'm not willing to go there. I am willing to go there around Fox and Rupert Murdoch, but that will have to be for a future conversation. So I guess in many ways you could say that Rush Limbaugh was a tool of those who took advantage of a certain social, ethical, political American malaise, and then used it as an asset in a hybrid warfare of destabilization in the United States of America, and as we pointed out earlier, in relationship to its foreign policy abroad and our involvement in such criminal acts and destabilizing acts as the aggressive war on Iraq, which Limbaugh was full-throated cheerleader for.
Absolutely. And so on that note, as we begin to wrap up, I do think we will have that conversation about Fox as that time goes on, because right now, I mean, there's a big hullabaloo surrounding Fox, in addition to other media such as Newsmax and OAN, and also obviously the Parler, the social media website, in terms of efforts, at least rhetorically, to even making it into the pages of the New York Times, of like taking Fox off of cable outlets and all that. I don't know how serious an outlet such as the New York Times is in regards to that, but rhetorically, I mean, it's a pretty big deal. But in a lot of cases, what that results in is the reactionary response by a lot of people that this is censorship, and it's absolutely it's unethical, and it's against our values and all this and that. And so in the future, as that conversation is going to be playing out more and more, I do think that this conversation, or this discussion of like what media such as Fox News, and also what these other outlets entail as well, what they actually do represent and do not represent in terms of this bigger discussion of intentions, and what these particular these networks of propaganda have, which are pretty much, go throughout like the American right wing at this point in time, in terms of what they represent and what they don't represent. It's going to become much more important it's going to become very important to have a wider, more wide-ranging discussion about this as time goes on, and as you continue to hear these rumblings being made about like how accepted should these forms of media be in our society. And then also, as we were talking about at the beginning, the concerns of another potential future worst case scenario, but it's something that I feel like we need to be honest about, scenarios, even potential, looking at the potential of another situation like we had back in 1995, again, with the greasing of the skids for all that was going on in the 90s with the way the threat of domestic terrorism was framed and all that. And so it's going to become an important conversation about zeroing in exactly on what Fox News does and does not represent, I think is very important going forward.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the discussion. I'm going to play our outro music to end our recording here. But if anybody in the room wants to raise any points after that, we're open to that. So, all right. Thank you very much. Antedote, we out.